Shalom, Chevre, Baruch HaShem family. Thank you for being here. Hope you had a wonderful Shabbat as we are counting the Omer this week for a couple more weeks. We welcome you to our Havdalah to start off the week, so we'll get underway. Hine el Yeshuati evtach velo echad Ki aziva zimrat Adonai Vayehi li Yeshua Ushavtem mayim besason Mimane ha-Yeshua L'Adonai ha-Yeshua Amcha Virchatecha Sela Adonai Tzebaot Imanu Miskav Lanu Elohei Yaakov Selah Adonai Tzebaot Ashrei Adam Boteach Bach Adonai Hoshia HaMelech Yanenu V'yom Koreinu LaYehudim Hayta Ora B'Simcha B'Sason Bika Kenti Elanu Kos Yeshuot Esa U'B'Shem Adonai Ekra La 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 Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam Borei peri hagefen amen. La 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 Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam borei minei vesamim amen La 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 Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam borei me'orei ha'esh amen La 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 Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam Hamavdil ben kodesh lecho beno lechoshech Ben Israel le'amim beyom hashvi'i L'sheshet yamei maseh Baruch atah Adonai Hamavdil ben kodesh lecho La 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 Eliyahu Hanavi Eliyahu Hatishbi Eliyahu Hagiladi Vimhera beyamenu Yavo aleinu Mashiach ben David Mashiach ben David Eliyahu Hanavi Eliyahu Hatishbi Eliyahu Hagiladi Shavuot Tov, everyone. And I'll just share briefly that last week I learned that the point that you enter the Shabbat is not just seeing 3 stars, but it's when you do Kiddush. It's the Kiddusha, that's the gateway or the door into Shabbat. And what we just did right there, the moment that we extinguish the flame from the Havdalah light, is the separation. So now we enter the week, and that is technically the moment that Shabbat ends. So if you haven't done Havdalah yet, or maybe you did it earlier because for whatever reason, that's exactly when your Shabbat ends. Just thought that was very interesting. So we're going to go ahead and count the Omer briefly. So if you'd like to turn to Psalm 67, this is read, we're going to do the blessing first, and then we're going to count the day. Today is the day after day 34. So, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu al sfirat ha'omer. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who sanctify us with your commandments and command us regarding the counting of the Omer. Psalm 67. For the conductor upon Neginot, a psalm, a song. May God favor us and bless us. May he illuminate his countenance with us. Selah. To make known your way on earth among all the nations, your salvation, your Yeshua. The peoples will acknowledge you, O God. The peoples will acknowledge you, all of them. Nations will be glad and sing for joy, because you will judge the peoples fairly and guide the nations on earth. Selah. The peoples will acknowledge you, O God. The peoples will acknowledge you, all of them. The earth has yielded its produce. May God, our own God, bless us. May God bless us, and may all the ends of the earth fear him. Amen. And today, Hayom Hamishi Ushloshim Yom Shehem Hamisha Shavuot LaOmer. Today is the 35th day of the Omer, which makes I forgot what week it is. 35th day of the Omer. 5 weeks. Sorry. Just drew a blank and lost my place. All right. Shavua Tov, everyone. I'm tossing it over to Rabbi Sean for our message for the evening.
All right. Shavua Tov. Thank you, Kevin. I wanted to look at a passage today from the Torah portion that we looked at, a more. And sometimes when I'm going through the portion, if I'm reading through it and there's something that I don't like because it's difficult, or it presents a question that I can't answer, it might just be my personality type, but I like to then dig deeper into that and sometimes ask, well, why does that make me uncomfortable? And should it make me uncomfortable? And explore those things. So the section of Amor that had me do that, although there could have been a few of them, I suppose. Some of these going through Leviticus, they're challenging portions. But I'd like to focus on Leviticus 24, verses 10 through 23. So I'm going to go ahead and read it, and then I'll talk about some of the things that I struggled with in this and what conclusions I drew from it. Again, this is Leviticus 24, verses 10 and following, and I'll be reading from the TLV. Now the son of an Israelite woman, whose father was an Egyptian, went out among Bnei Israel, and a fight broke out between the Israelite woman's son and an Israelite man. The Israelite woman's son blasphemed the name and cursed, so they brought him to Moses. His mother's name was Shalomit, the daughter of Dibri of the tribe of Dan. They put him in custody until the will of Adonai can be declared to them. Then Adonai spoke to Moses, saying, "Bring the one who cursed out of the camp, and let all who heard him lay their hands on his head, and have the entire congregation stone him. Then you will speak to Bnei Israel, saying, whoever curses his God will bear his sin. Whoever blasphemes the name of Adonai must surely be put to death. The whole congregation must stone him. The outsider, as well as the native born, when he blasphemes the name, is to be put to death. Whoever mortally strikes down any man must surely be put to death. Whoever mortally strikes down an animal is to make restitution, life for life. If anyone injures his neighbor, as he has done, the same is to be done for him. Fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. Just as he has injured someone, so it should be done to him. Whoever kills an animal is to make restitution, but the one who kills a man is to be put to death. You are to have one standard of justice for the outsider as well as the native born, for I am Adonai your God. So Moses spoke to Bnei Israel, and they led the one who had cursed out of the camp, then stoned him with rocks. Thus Bnei Israel did as Adonai commanded Moses. So first you might be asking me, why did I have a problem with that, at least initially? And I'll tell you. I don't know about you if you've ever said something, maybe you wish you hadn't. You might stub your toe, or someone cuts you off on the highway, or your adrenaline is peaked, and you say something foolish. I know I have. And maybe that's part of the reason why I read this. I thought, man, this guy, he just said one thing wrong. I mean, granted, he cursed the name of God. Okay, that's a bad thing. But I'm sure many people have done that and not been put to death. They say a word even against God. I mean, you see even in the Psalms, the psalmist will question God and say even some harsh things to God and not be put to death. So initially it seemed harsh that, he wasn't even being punished for the fight, it seems. But this thing that he said and people heard it and then he had to die. And I thought, man, that's rough. And so part of me wanted to just move on and find another passage. And the other part of me said, no, don't leave. You have to dig in. And maybe there's a reason why you're perturbed by it. Maybe you need to explore that. So I did. And what I found, and I'm sure there's more digging. There's always more digging you could do on a passage. But just going beneath the surface a little bit, there's context for this that must be considered. So what do we learn about this man that was put to death? Well, it says in verse 10, he was the son of an Israelite woman whose father was an Egyptian. And he also got in a fight with an Israelite man. That's the first verse. Tells you those three things about him. Israelite mother, Egyptian father, got into a fight with another Israelite man. Not the father, but the son that we're referring to. So I know the rabbis, in the Talmud, they had other things to say about the context that frankly may or may not be true, because we only have what the Torah tells us here. And some of that commentary can color, perhaps. It can be a resource to us. But I think our conclusion needs to line up with what the text says. So we see from this, one thing that's noted is the mother is named, the father, however, is not. And that interested me, that, perhaps his father wasn't there, or perhaps, his parents weren't together, which is no sin on part of the child. The child can't control their parental situation, of course. But it could tell you maybe some of the trouble that this person is facing, and even perhaps some of the stigma within the community because of not only his mixed parentage and an Egyptian, the people who enslaved his people that they escaped from. So you have that, but then perhaps that his father was absent as well was part of the stigma. And then, the other man doesn't get punished. So it seems like the fight and the reason for the fight is attributed to this man who was put to death, at least in the eyes of the people. They sided against him. So that's some context. And then they named the woman in verse 11. What's interesting, I believe that this is the only woman named in the entire book of Leviticus. And it is not a favorable reference here. Doesn't seem to be. She's referred to as the Israelite woman whose son blasphemed the name and cursed. They brought him to Moses. His mother's name was Shelomit, the daughter of Dibri of the tribe of Dan. So, and as I said, there are some rabbinic commentary around who she was. It was said that maybe she was licentious, or, she was not the greatest woman of virtue. We have to go based on what we have here in the Torah. So they put him in custody. What can we draw from this? One thing that I noted is this man didn't kill the woman's son, who's the man in question. The Israelite man didn't kill him, and then the community didn't kill him. Okay, so maybe we're giving them too much credit, but that's something to be noted, that they saw this offense and they thought that they should seek God in and through the agency of Moses for what the punishment is. Getting out of that, the heat of the passion, if you will. Because I don't know, perhaps you've encountered this, when something is happening in front of you, there is the impulse to act, and sometimes your passion takes over, your emotions take over, testosterone, you get into the monkey brain mode, and you might do something rash, you might do something that you regret later. But if I can credit the Israelites here, at least they said, look, we see something that we think was way out of hand. And rather than take it into our own hands to bring punishment as the community of Israel, we're going to bring it to Moses and seek the Lord on this thing, which I think is a commendable principle. So it's very interesting what happens here, because they put him in custody until the will of Adonai could be declared to them. So there's some waiting period. And then Adonai spoke to Moses. And the first thing that he says in verse 14 is to bring the one who cursed out of the camp. Let all who heard him lay their hands on his head and have the entire congregation stone him. So in one sense, he's allowing the community to bring punishment on this man. But they have to get their hands dirty. First, they have to actually show themselves who they are as the accusers. They have to physically lay their hands upon the man to attest, like witnesses, that we saw this. We are the ones, in essence, carrying out this judgment in the name of the Lord. So there is a weightiness, just like how Rabbi Ari talks about when an animal is slaughtered. You understand the cost of that life. But then the Lord goes further. In verse 15, you will speak to Bnei Israel, saying, whoever curses his God will bear his sin. And I just want to say that I think this is more than just these two guys were fighting and the Shelomit's son uttered something under his breath. I believe, based on everything I'm reading in this passage, there was more than that. It wasn't just that he said a foolish word in the heat of passion. I believe that perhaps the nature of this dispute was Shelomit's son, because it doesn't refer to him by name, which is interesting. But he was perhaps invoking his father's God, his Egyptian father's God. Or at the very least, he was seeking to insult the Israelite man's God. So there was not just an attack on the Israelite man, but an attack on his God. And it was very straightforward in the eyes of the people. It wasn't like, oh, he said some foolish words when he was angry, which is also sinful. But it seems that this is a very intentional attack on the Lord of Israel by this man, in addition to, an attack on the Israelite man. So there was this compounded offense. And perhaps for the Israelites, as I mentioned, the stigma, they might have thought, well, maybe they had something against this man in the first place. So what the Lord does here is very interesting, because he says, yes, you should hold this man accountable. But then he says, whoever curses his God will bear his sin. So in a way, this somewhat turns on the children of Israel. They have to carry out this thing. God's not just going to strike him down. They have to get their hands dirty and carry out this judgment against this man. But then the same burden and the same accountability, if you will, is placed upon the Israelites. So in verse 15, you will speak to Bnei Israel, saying, whoever curses his God will bear his sin. 16, whoever blasphemes the name of Adonai must surely be put to death. The whole congregation must stone him. The outsider as well as the native born, when he blasphemes the name, is to be put to death. And that's a heavy word for the children of Israel. Because if it was something light or flippant that this man did, let's take it that way for a second. Then what God is saying is, yeah, you see how he just uttered those foolish words and is being put to death for it. The same will happen to you if you utter those foolish words. That is very weighty. And you're going to carry out the judgment, and the same group of people will carry the judgment out on you, children of Israel, if you transgress in this way. So if you were to take it the other way and say that this man made a very deliberate affront at the God of Israel, still the same principle applies. If any of the children of Israel come against their God and blaspheme the name, they will also be held accountable in the same way to be put to death. So maybe they thought that God was going to have another standard of justice, and that's not what is coming to pass. 17, whoever mortally strikes down any man must surely be put to death. It's odd that this eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth section comes here. It almost seems to hint at they're ending this man's life and understand the weight of that. Understand if you undertake this, because they didn't necessarily even have to bring the accusation. They chose to bring the accusation. And maybe they were right in doing that. But there was also this weight added on them that, you know what, you could be guilty of this too. And the penalty would be the same. And this section goes until verse 20. And it talks about the life of an animal and the life of a man. And basically, there's a point here that, whoever kills an animal is to make restitution, but the one who kills a man is to be put to death, is verse 21. That the life of a man is very significant. And it's almost as if God is giving them this preparation speech before they carry out this act of stoning one of their own. Granted, he had an Egyptian father, but he was still of the tribe of Dan, and his mother's name was Shelomit, of the people. So they were putting to death one of their own. So this was a serious thing, and God wanted them to feel the weight of what they were doing, the choice they were making, and what they were seeking to carry out. So we see in verse 23, Moses spoke to Bnei Israel. They led the one who had cursed out of the camp, then stoned him with rocks. Thus Bnei Israel did as Adonai commanded Moses. It's a heavy passage, for sure. So what principles can we draw from this? Well, first, I would say, and this is from verses 10 through 12, that we, as children of God, the body of Yeshua, Jew and Gentile, should seek God for guidance when we have a dispute. And not just, oh God, show me what to do, but the children of Israel also sought the leaders, namely Moses in this case, a leader among the house of Israel, for resolution to a dispute. And they didn't know what response he was going to come back with. He could have said they were wrong for accusing him or anything. So they made themselves accountable in that way. And we should seek God for guidance and proper leadership in whatever sphere we are operating in when we have a dispute. Next, and this is, I'm drawing from verses 13 to 21, that we should seek justice and restitution for those involved. A punishment should meet the nature of the crime. And again, I just want to reiterate that it was the Israelites who called this man out on this sin. perhaps they could have overlooked the sin, but they chose not to. And again, we have to choose as people what. There's a saying that one of my associates used to share with me, and it was, "Don't sweat the petty stuff and don't pet the sweaty stuff." Sometimes we have to choose whether we even want to get involved in a dispute. Does God want us to get involved in that dispute? Is this our battle? Is this someone else's battle? Or should this battle even be fought? And I don't want to try to answer that for the children of Israel in this passage, because obviously you see what happened. They did pick this battle, and it had grave consequence for this man, but then also a stern warning for the house of Israel. And maybe even the institution of a rule that wasn't so firmly in place, even though you had the 10 Commandments, of course, in Exodus 20. So there was this idea about, not taking the name in vain, but it wasn't spelled out to this measure. So we see, even with aviation rules, they're usually written because someone messed up and someone died, and now we have a rule because of it. That maybe if that didn't happen, we wouldn't have this hard and fast. So again, but what we need to take from this, I think, is that we should seek justice and restitution for those involved. It doesn't say what the nature of the dispute was between these two men, why they even got in a fight. And it seems that the other man was off the hook, in a sense, of what caused the fight, or they weren't punished for the fight, per se. That wasn't the issue. Third, and this is what I feel is the driving force of this passage, perhaps Israel, there are sayings in the Psalms, writings in the Psalms and the Proverbs: do not laugh when your enemy falls. Do not boast when your enemy falls. And it's hard to know because the Torah only tells us what the Torah tells us here. But if there was any sense among the children of Israel of like boasting or gloating, that this man with the Egyptian father was being put to death, this was going to be a double-edged sword, what they were carrying out, because God was saying, look, understand, you can go ahead and do this. In fact, now you've brought it to me and you must carry this out. But this same weight is placed upon you if you blaspheme the name. You will be put to death. So you can imagine that those were going and laying hands on this man. They are now seeing themselves perhaps in that spot if they were to make the same mistake. And it wasn't that God was going to judge this man harsher because his father was an Egyptian. That may have been a human judgment, but that wasn't God's judgment, you see. So in conclusion, God is just. And even when we encounter these passages that are perplexing, I don't claim to understand everything about this portion. But just from a little bit of digging, I could see that there's much more to the picture. And frankly, that when we get offended by a passage that we're reading in the Torah, for instance, we should dig a little deeper into it and seek to learn from it and not assume that we know better than God.